If you have any questions for our host, please pop them in the Q&A tab on the very far right, and our host will address them at the end of the session. Please note the chat section here is more for general chat, so if you do have any questions, just make sure they're in the Q&A tab so we don't miss them. Great. Well, I'm going to let you guys kick start, and we'll see you at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca, and welcome everyone to our session on ethical and responsible AI. The main part of the title is where do we go from here? And I'll elaborate a little bit about some of this after we do some introductions. My name is Usama Fayyad. I am the Executive Director of the Institute for Experiential AI at Northeastern University, where I'm also a professor of computer science there. I'm also chairman of Open Insights, and I've spent most of my life working on making AI and machine learning work in many practical applications across many industries, inclusive of science data analysis, all the way to applications with corporations and governments and so forth. I'm going to ask, we have a very distinguished panel of real deep experts in the area of ethical AI and what it means. We know that this is very confusing to many. Many companies and organizations and governments don't know what to do, how to approach the field responsibly, and more importantly, how to detect when something is wrong, is happening. And this brings in the second part, where do we go from here? So when you know something is wrong, and something will go wrong in terms of biases that you don't mean to have, in terms of side effects that you didn't think about that kind of take you into unethical grounds, how do you deal with it? And where do you take it from there? So those are things to ponder. I have a bunch of questions for the panel, and we're hoping to leave the last 10 minutes or so for the audience. Please type in your questions like Rebecca mentioned. With this, I'd like to turn it over to my colleagues on the panel, and if you could each introduce yourself, starting with Tina, and then Ricardo and Christo.
Thank you, Usama. My name is Tina Eliassi-Rad. I'm a professor of computer science and network science at Northeastern University. My background is in AI and machine learning, and I have a project called Just Machine Learning that's related to this panel. Thank you.
Yeah, my name is Ricardo Baeza-Yates. I'm a research professor at the Institute for Experiential AI. And I have been working on bias in systems for more than 10 years. And then naturally, I'm very interested in fairness and ethical aspects of AI.
And I'm Christo Wilson. I'm an associate professor in Corey College at Northeastern University. And my research largely focuses on this thing called algorithm auditing. So I look at the systems that people are deploying to try to understand, does it have bias? Does it have some kind of unfairness? Is there something going on that the designers didn't intend? And what is the impact of that on people's lives?
Okay, thank you for those introductions. Just to add color to those introductions, all our panelists are very familiar with AI and machine learning. They have practiced it, they have applied it. Ricardo also happens to be one of the world leading experts on information retrieval and search. So they have very interesting perspectives on seeing the technology at work and then taking a step back and saying, what the heck are we doing with all this technology? So on that theme, I'm going to turn it over probably for Tina to do an opening kind of position statement, 1 or 2 minutes of what you think the issues are, what you're hoping to get out of this panel, what you're hoping the audience will get out of this panel, and then we'll go through with Christo and Ricardo.
Great. Thank you, Usama. You have no business designing technology for society when you know nothing about society. This sentence is by Sophia Noble, who's the author of Algorithms of Oppression, and I agree with her. If technology is going to be used in our society, especially in high stakes, life-altering situations, such as criminal justice, law enforcement, employment decisions, credit scoring, healthcare, public eligibility assessment, and school assignment, then we need to teach our technologists about society, civics, and ethics. Leaving them to their own devices or having ethics committees or boards on the side as an afterthought is destined to fail. Thank you.
Thank you, Tina. Christo?
So I guess what I'm hoping to convince everyone is that if we're hoping to end up in a world where we're using machine learning and AI ethically, we need independent oversight. The same way that we have things like red team reviews for cybersecurity, right, to double check and make sure that things are okay in practice out there in the wild, you need the same kind of thing for AI and machine learning systems. No team will ever be able to fully understand the systems they're deploying in complicated real-world contexts. So you need this external kind of auditing to double check assumptions, right? Make sure that things are going the way you think they are. And this needs to happen, periodically over time, because the technology is both affected by its context, but it also affects the context, right? This interplay causes things to change over time. Now, if you're hearing me say this and you're saying, well, no company would ever be willing to do that and have that kind of external checking, I think that this can actually be a competitive advantage to have this level of transparency and be forthright, about what you claim the systems are doing, and to say they've been checked and they are actually behaving that way. You can do this without having a competitive disadvantage or, compromising, protected information.
So continue with, if you want to avoid having an audit, taking Christo's point, so the first thing is you need awareness. So awareness of what you are doing and how your system works. And for that, you need to make many questions that maybe they are not being made in this era. So things like what are the possible discriminations in my output? What are possible biases in my input? Do I have an incentive function in the whatever we're optimizing with machine learning that may cause some kind of discrimination? These are the questions that you need to answer before even you design the system, because the design will be basically driven by the answers to these questions. And that's something that we haven't done yet. We haven't had, there's some work, like Ben Schneiderman and other people are working on how to develop trustworthy software, but they still were far from there. And at the end it's about ethics. So an ethics is like privacy. So it's individual, but also depends on the rest. For example, depends on the ethics of your providers and depends on the ethics of your clients. You're not alone there. And then the question is how we can work with this. So, and the first thing, and I don't remember who said it, but it's an interesting opinion paper that says something very obvious that I think is important to remember. There can't be AI ethics if we don't have ethics.
Thank you, everybody, for those statements. I'm going to direct the first question to Christo, but of course, other panelists are welcome to answer as well if they have their own point of view. Let's talk about audits. I mean, to many people in the audience, they might say algorithmic audits. What is that, right? And number one is like, what do you see? And there's several firms offering this, several groups. What do you see that's done well? What do you see that's done poorly? And what should a serious organization who seriously is thinking about this, what should they think about in terms of doing an audit, algorithmic audit?
Yeah. So if you're curious, if you've never heard this term before, when we're talking about algorithm audits in this case, what we're saying is that someone should go and look at the system you're building and assess whether it has bias or unfairness, and that needs to be kind of socio-technical, right? The code works the way you say, and it's fair. That was also taking into account kind of where it's being deployed, right? In a credit scoring scenario or an employment scenario, and the kind of unique context there. So what concerns me, as you mentioned, is that there are now companies popping up that will claim to do this. They'll say, we will audit your systems. And I'm concerned about that because it's totally unclear what the baselines for that are. Is this like a paper trail kind of audit where someone comes in and looks at your documentation and you say it's fair and they say, okay, check, it's fair. Or is this like a serious code audit where someone's looking through code, statistically analyzing data? Or is this even broader, right? Is this something like where they come in and look at the stakeholders of the system, the users, the clients, find out what their needs are, what the problems are in that kind of technological space? These baselines are totally unclear. So if you're thinking about engaging in an algorithm audit, I think you have to think very carefully about what do you expect the outcome of that to be. Right? To me, the ideal outcome is something that's very transparent. Right? You have statements that you've made about how a system should be functioning, and then those statements are being verified in a very broad sense, both socio-technically, but also deeply technically, like looking at the code, looking at the data. And then all of that needs to be made more or less public, right? To build confidence that what you said is true and that the audit is believable, right? It was conducted by experts in a way that is transparent. Lacking that transparency, this whole exercise seems a bit pointless.
Thank you. Very good comments. I'm gonna target the second question to Tina. There is this notion of fair AI and unfair AI. The question is there such a thing in principle? Can we ever get to something that we can call fair AI? And what should we be doing to minimize bias and unethical technology use?
Excellent question. So it depends on what you mean by fair. There's no single definition of fairness. The general answer to your broad question is no. We can never get to fair AI, even in principle. A few years ago, DARPA asked a similar question: is computational ethics within reach if we solve X problems? The answer was no then, and it is no now. However, you can have a narrow sense of fairness. For example, we have a system called RawlsNet that makes policy recommendations based on the Rawlsian fair equality of opportunity. But this broad sense of fair AI is not achievable. In terms of what we can do now, educate the public, diversify the teams that are building technology, incorporate value in design, as Helen Nissenbaum has been advocating since the mid-1990s. Have warning labels, or if you like, nutrition labels on your systems. It is not the master algorithm. It is not the master system, right? It works better on some subpopulations than others, for example. We should hold technologists legally and financially accountable for the harm their technologies cause. And we should change the culture among the technologists. Just because you can build it doesn't mean you should.
Great points, Tina, and especially one that people don't think much about, which is, what is the mix of the team that kind of built this technology? Because that's where a lot of the biases creep in, for sure. Related to that, Ricardo, Tina highlights kind of the things we should watch out for and what should we do. I would characterize much of the work we've seen out there on responsible AI and ethical AI, etc., kind of always goes to the, unlike what Tina highlighted in terms of action, it goes to identifying problems, then saying the sky is falling, good luck, guys, right? What in your mind do you think we should be doing to kind of ameliorate this? And how do we coexist and live with these challenges that will always be there, according to Tina, and I truly believe that.
No, a great question, because we are really developing that field and we don't know much yet. But before answering your question, I would like to point out that today was released, or will be released, and I haven't checked, the European Union regulation for AI, which is something like GDPR, that is data protection, and it's like a horizontal law. Because the European Union doesn't have access to the local laws of countries, but now things like GDPR and the new AI regulation are like things that are applicable to everyone, to every field, to every company, to every person, which in some sense is good, but in other senses is bad, because we are trying to fit one shoe for all people, right? But that's something interesting there that I think will will emphasize what Tina said, is that, for example, on what things can do, on what AI systems can do, they said that you cannot deploy subliminal techniques beyond a person's consciousness in order to materially distort a person's behavior in a manner that causes or is likely to cause that person or another person physical or psychological harm. So imagine the many questions now we need to discuss. What is subliminal technique, okay? And then are you changing the person's behavior? Are you causing, let's say physical harm is easy to define, but what about psychological harm? So this will be a difficult time to want to.
Yeah, I mean, it truly is a minefield here. I mean, this will, you might even argue that advertising for a product that has sugar in it will become illegal under this law. But please continue with answering the question.
Yes, you got exactly to the point. I don't think I'm arguing that. I think that will be illegal maybe in the EU soon. I mean, fast food may be illegal very soon. But what things we can do to mitigate things? So things we can do is like check the input for known biases. And we have things like gender, ethnia, age, and so on, religion. But the problem is that sometimes the bias it doesn't come only from data, although some very famous people insist on that. But for example, maybe in the optimization function we're using, and maybe completely without knowing it and without any bad intention, like monetization. We're trying to minimize the revenue, and the best case for me is the Deliveroo result in Italy about discriminating people that couldn't deliver food in dinner time because they were not the best for the company to deliver food in dinner time. So these biases are pretty impossible to find. You need to do this posteriori analysis, and like Christo said, we need some kind of internal audit to see if these things are happening. And finally, also you need to check what is happening in the feedback loop of your system, if you have a feedback loop, because many of the biases come from basically the things you can click, like popularity bias, or the things you can see, like exposure bias, and those depends on the system too. So the system is writing, in some sense, their own future. So we need to check about all these things and then asking the ethical questions that I mentioned at the beginning in my opening statement.
Okay. I see a lot of questions from the audience, so I'm going to ask one last question of the panel, probably directed to Tina and Christo, and then we'll switch over to some of the great questions that the audience is posting, and I encourage you to post more. What do you think will be the biggest danger we face in the current direction of AI practice? Kind of what will be the natural forces that will drive reforms here?
So I think we're going to see even more division and disenfranchisement among our population. When you look at automated decision making, every day we hear another story about how an automated tool caused harm to usually a member of an underrepresented minority group. And those kinds of perceptions of unfairness can accelerate the collapse of our shared norms and beliefs. And that in turn harms our democracy. And I've written about this, and if people are interested, I can send them the papers. And then in America, unlike Europe, I think successful lawsuits with big cash payouts will derive reform.
Christo, any comments on this one before we switch over to the audience?
Yeah, I mean, I was very heartened to see the FTC's announcement yesterday about, a biased algorithm potentially being under Section 5. Yeah, I mean, I largely agree with Tina. Most of the systems that we're talking about are opaque. We don't know where the data is coming from. We don't know what the objectives are. We don't know how they're being deployed all the time. But they exist, they're being built, and they have huge scalability. So, in some sense, the bad things can happen very fast, at large scale before anyone's even aware. And at that point, it's now entrenched. So, trying to back out from a bad situation, I would rather not be in that bad situation in the first place, right? Which means we need to be focusing on how we educate better technologists, how we lay preemptive regulations, like something like what Europe is talking about, where high-stakes systems have to be vetted. before they are deployed. Because otherwise we cede control.
Yeah. Let me switch over to audience questions. A question from Sabrina: do we need regulation to force reforms and change behaviors? This is very related to what was just being said. Tina suggested we need big lawsuits, but what do you think is the role of regulation to all of you, or whoever wants to answer?
Maybe I can add something that to complement what was already said is that I would prefer auto-regulation, but we have seen that doesn't seem to work. But that I think that's a mistake for our field, because then insurance companies will take over. Like if we have like big basically big things in court, and then will be something much worse, because these systems will be much more expensive to develop. And also, I think then, as Tina said, the perception changes, and then we also change the perception of people of the good things about technology, because we are just looking always at the bad part. But there are many interesting applications of AI that are really helping to improve the conditions of living of many people. But we are only focusing on the news on the bad parts.
So the institution that's relatively ahead of the big tech here is FDA. They use machine learning in medical devices. They had a document, I think about a year and a half ago, about good machine learning practices. And I think the reason is because drug companies were sued successfully for lots of money. So this is not where big tech is leading. It's where governmental institution like FDA is leading, because regulation without teeth is nothing.
Another great question from Leah. There's a lot of use of the term ethics, and there's a growing need for ethicists in companies due to multiple challenges. But I know that the ethical discussion is often reduced to context of compliance. What do you think about this? I know whether Christo, maybe you can start us off.
I mean, unfortunately, I think that Leah is right. Ethics is a big, messy, complicated space, and it's easy to just boil that down to, well, what are the regulations or the kind of minimum bars I need to hit? The same thing you'd say about compliance with privacy regulation. What I'm hoping is that we can change this conversation, so it's not about just compliance, but it starts with a much deeper and more fundamental discussion. You're building a system, it's going to be out in the world. What is the kind of equity or justice that needs to be baked into it from the start? So you choose, what do you want to see in the world, and then start backing out from that, right? How does that inform the choice of success metrics, the choice of objectives? How does that then inform the kinds of stakeholders you engage with, the kinds of data that you're going to need? And by sort of starting from that strong normative baseline, that then drives all the later decisions.
And that's by the way a big cultural change, because often we are technology driven. Let's see where this technology takes us, as opposed to outcomes driven. Any other comments before I move to Lynn's great question? Okay, Lynn asks, how can you create unbiased / ethical AI when historical training data is biased? How can you compensate? Maybe we start with Tina and Ricardo on this one, I think. But, definitely if you have anything, Christo.
It's difficult. I mean, the solutions that the machine learning people and computer scientists have are just superficial. So you need to know the context. As I said, you need to know society, and you need to know how society works for certain technology that you're putting out. So it's not just about the data. In fact, it's about the entire machine learning or AI lifecycle. You are highlighting the data, and you need to be aware of the policies, the laws, how they were executed, how the data was collected, so on and so forth. It's difficult.
I think a safe theme here is to always assume the data, by its nature, it's a snapshot, and therefore it will contain all sorts of biases that we don't think about. Christo or Ricardo, any additions on this one?
Yeah, right. I mean, I think Tina had a good summary, and my example in Deliveroo is like sometimes will not be in the data. So it's not only data the problem. So we need to remember that. But sometimes the bias in the data is not something you already know. And even if something is already known, sometimes you don't know what is the baseline. So what is the right comparison point? So how much are you biased? Sometimes they can only guess, and this is already one important thing, is to know the direction where you have to go. Like, for example, gender parity, we know the direction we have to go. What is the right answer in every field, for example, of work? We don't know that. That would be a societal answer. It's not you who will decide, it will be society deciding.
Okay, next question is from Zane Yolis. Ideas on teams that write code, gender, age, etc. I think both Tina and Christo alluded to this. Any ideas that are pragmatic and can help here?
You want teams that are as diverse as your population, right? In America, we have a very diverse population. You want to have that lived experience in the team that's developing technology.
And I'll extend that with disciplinary diversity, right? It's not just the coders and the data scientists. I mean, you need sociologists and psychologists and anthropologists to get at that larger social context. And then, of course, the other pitfall is US team deploying systems that are global. All of a sudden, you get context collapse. So you have to be really careful.
I will add that maybe also sometimes you have more than one team to see how different you can be the result. And there's a very nice experiment on data science that was done with that basically different teams think different, and maybe you want diversity on the solution process. And also, there's already one work that shows that this diversity really makes a difference, and basically the biases of the creators can be embedded in the code.
And by the way, Tina's answer actually evoked a whole bunch of cheering from many audiences in different countries. So great answer. The next question is from Raymond Pettit from UCSD. Great panel. Thank you. The CEO of Kellogg spoke to us yesterday about their use of AI and ethical and societal issues they want to foster. Is this issue the panel presented applicable widely across most industries, or is it limited to tech and IT companies?
No, it's widely applicable because, like, HR companies want to use AI and machine learning. The banks want to use machine learning and AI. Like, it's all over.
Yeah. In fact, the banks do use it, and credit scoring is one of the most problematic and growing issues here. Last question we can take from the audience, even though there are many great ones, because I want to leave opportunity for you guys to give some closing statements. What are the current trends in terms of AI regulation? Are there any consortiums of note? This is from Vinay.
Well, I talked about Europe. So Europe seems to be leading the way. I mean, I'm not aware of too much in the U.S. at this point, other than the FTC invoking their existing powers and trying to sort of recast it as perhaps something a little bit more broader.
There were some initiatives last year, but they didn't went forward, and some of them even pushed by the current vice president of the U.S. And maybe they will be put again back onto the table about the regulations similar to what we are seeing in the European Union. But something important related to the previous question is that for this regulation, also we need to look at diversity. I mean, cultures are different. Like ethics and law, for example, in the Muslim world are completely viewed in a completely different way. The same with maybe other Oriental cultures, that they look at ethics in a different way. So we need to also to consider that how we see things is not the way that the world should see it.
There's an interesting bill in front of the New York City Council about mandating audits and doing compliance for machine learning and hiring, which perhaps could be a model for other things in this country.
That's a great point. Okay, so we are at time and we're beginning to lose our audience. We had peaked well above 130. I'm going to give you each a minute to answer in one sentence 2 questions, right? 1 sentence each, starting with Tina, Christo, and Ricardo. What do you want the audience to take away from this panel? And what should we be scared most of in this current trajectory? So over to you, Tina.
So for the first one, it's a question for the technologist. Would you want your technology to be used on you for high-stakes decisions? And for the second one, I'll quote Ruha Benjamin, who's the author of Race After Technology. The road to hell is paved with technical fixes.
Christo, your 2 sentences for 2 questions?
Well, I guess my parting statement for the audience is to not lose hope. I mean, what I want people to take away from this is that if you got into tech because you think about using technology for good, this is an opportunity to build technology for good and innovate in a way that is really just like impactful for people's lives, right? Seize these challenges as opportunities.
So 2 things. One is think about the problem, not about the technology. So don't try to find a problem where you can use blockchain, for example. There are too many of those already. Right? So technological solutionism is more of the same. There's nothing new there. So this is the first thing. And the second thing is please try to think on how to use AI to protect us from the dangers of AI.
All right, a recursive use of AI as the concluding remark for this panel. I know we've hit our time, and I'm grateful for the audience that attended. I'm going to try to capture the questions that we didn't answer and answer them on the social media. I'm sure our panelists will be happy to provide those answers, and we'll try to document this in a blog. Thank you, everyone. Ricardo, Tina, Christo, for a great discussion. Amazingly germane and important topic.